Hello, my name is Sarah Wheeler and I'm the head of the Anti-Money Laundering Division here at the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, and I'm here today to talk to you about our recently published guidance notes on assessing risk and applying a risk-based approach. So this presentation today is designed to try and give you a high-level overview of not just our recent amendments to the anti-money laundering regulations which prompted our guidance notes published earlier this year, but actually a brief reminder of all of the principles around applying a risk-based approach. So we'll start with a background and overview to the concept and talk about what is a risk-based approach. We'll look at the components of a risk-based approach, how you go about risk assessing and identifying risks, then move on to the mitigation and management aspects, including ongoing monitoring, look at emerging risks, then we'll emphasise the importance of documentation before making some conclusions and then giving you a brief summary of the overview of the changes to the regulations. So the guidance notes on the prevention and detection of money laundering, terrorist financing and proliferation of financing have been reviewed and amended by the authority as part of our ongoing effort to keep our measures relevant and up to date, and in particular the section on assessing risk and applying a risk-based approach was amended and republished in February this year. So this presentation is going to cover an overview of that section and also cover some of the changes made and the impact of those changes. So what is a risk-based approach? These are words that most financial institutions are very familiar with, and yet their practical application can be quite difficult to determine. Well, the standard definition of a risk-based approach means that countries, competent authorities and financial institutions are expected to identify, assess and understand their money laundering, terrorist financing risks to which they are exposed and take measures commensurate with those risks in order to mitigate them effectively and apply resource to where the risks are greatest. I'm just going to repeat the end part of that again, apply resource to where the risks are greatest. And this really is the nub of the risk-based approach, which is that you shouldn't be applying equal resource to all of your risks, but based on your assessment of risks, really apply your time and attention and resource to where you think there is a greatest risk in order to really effectively mitigate and manage those risks. So this concept of the risk-based approach is captured by the Financial Action Task Force Recommendation 1 and is actually central to all the effective implementation of the FATF recommendations. So what are the components of a risk-based approach? Well, the first key starting point is that you understand the inherent risks facing your business. So classically, that would be looking at your customer risk, your product, services and transactions risks, your geographic risks, such as the countries of operation of your business, and delivery channels. But you also need to consider the inherent risks relevant to you, so risks identified in national risk assessments, sectoral risk assessments like those published by CIMA in March 2020, and other open sources of information that may enable you to better understand inherent risk. Once you've identified your inherent risks, and identified those customers that may fall into higher risk categories as a result, you then need to identify and apply measures to effectively and efficiently mitigate and manage those risks. You also need to put in place policies, procedures and information systems to monitor changes to those risks, and that's where the ongoing monitoring obligations come into a really effective risk-based approach. Finally, and another really key point, you need to document those risk assessments, document those strategies, document those ongoing monitoring procedures, and also any frequent reassessments of those procedures and policies, and make sure that that is somewhere that can be independently viewed, seen and understood by people like CIMA who may wish to examine and look at those documents. So I just alluded to the inherent risk categories that you and your business will need to consider when applying a risk-based approach. And I mentioned customer, geographic risk, so country where your customers may be based, product, services and transaction and delivery channels, and also those risks relevant to you through open source of information. So in the first instance, when financial service providers are considering the risks relevant to them, they need to think about what affects their specific business and they can go to the public domain to look at information that has been published at national level and by relevant supervisory authorities to understand better identified inherent risks. For example, national risk assessments. The Cayman Islands has recently published a number of those, from terrorist financing to legal persons and arrangements to the sectoral risk assessments published by CIMA. These all help inform your understanding on a nuanced level of the overall inherent risks for your business in that sector. You also want to consider any piece of information from law enforcement agencies and the Financial Reporting Authority about trends and typologies, guidance, circulars, advisories, and other communications from the authority or any other relevant authorities, and of course information provided to you by your industry associations, as well as international standard setting bodies such as the Financial Action Task Force. So let's now look again at those aspects of inherent risks that are so key to applying a risk-based approach. The first is customer risk. So when assessing the money laundering risks of a customer, financial services providers should consider the customer's business or activity, reputation, nature, and behaviour. So high-risk factors include: is the customer a politically exposed person, a PEP? Are they from a public body or a state-owned entity from a jurisdiction with high levels of corruption, or do they enjoy a high public profile that might enable them to abuse that position for private gain? More broadly, it could be a high-risk factor that a customer is simply unable to provide robust evidence of their identity, or if there's anything else that just causes a financial services provider to have doubts about the veracity or accuracy of that customer's identity. Equally, a customer risk might be associated with an ownership structure that appears unusual or excessively complex given the nature of the applicant's customer and business. We can also look at the risks associated with specific countries or geographic risk. Now, these risks actually inform your risk assessment across all categories, whether it's customers, products, transactions, or services or delivery channels. But taking this as a separate category for now, you would obviously need to consider whether the country where the client comes from or where the business is being conducted is subject to sanctions, embargoes, or similar measures. You need to think about the nature and purpose of your customer's business relationship within that jurisdiction, the level of money laundering and TF risk within the jurisdiction, and the level of predicate offences relevant to money laundering within the jurisdiction. And this will make a country high risk. There are also low risk factors. So, if it's a country that has effective mutual evaluations, detailed assessment reports from credible independent sources has been verified to have effective AML-CFT systems and low levels of corruption, you may determine that informs a low geographic risk. Your next consideration will be product, services, and transactions risk. So financial services providers, when assessing the risk associated with this, should consider the level of transparency or opaqueness around the particular product or services or transaction, how complex the product, service, or transaction is going to be, the value or size of the product, services, or transaction. So, for example, you may have products and services in capital markets that are high volume, high frequency, and very complex. This may constitute a risk factor. We then, of course, have delivery channel risk, so the role of introducers and intermediaries, which can be much more risky when business relationships are not necessarily always conducted on a face-to-face basis. And the geographical location, of course, of those introducers may again be a factor, and the nature of those relationships and how they are used. So having identified your inherent risk categories and hopefully have worked out which of your customers and clients may fall into those high risk categories, essentially allow them to come to the top of the pot for your assessment of a risk-based approach, how would you then manage and mitigate against those risks? So financial services providers have a number of tools at their disposal to manage and mitigate those risks. And this includes adjusting the scope of the identification and verification requirements or your ongoing monitoring, So that's your CDD, as we'll come on to talk about. Applying transaction limits for higher risk customers or products. Requiring senior management approval for certain actions, e.g. high risk or large transactions, or when you're establishing relationships with high risk customers such as PEPs. So typical controls to fulfill those objectives would be, as I mentioned before, your client due diligence. So in some circumstances, you may choose to use enhanced due diligence, which is a more robust and detailed way of assessing your client's identification and verifying that identification. You may use transaction and account monitoring in a more rigorous way. You may set transaction limits. You may have some employee screening, scrubbing client lists, assessing new products. Lots of methods and policies and procedures you can put in place to manage those risks where you think they're higher. You can use your internal reporting and external reporting in an effective way to assess and manage risk. And then, of course, another control is you can use training of your staff so they're very aware of certain aspects of risk and can respond quickly to them. And finally, as we mentioned before, senior management approval for certain types of relationship. So making sure that there's that senior management awareness of money laundering risks, and management and mitigation of that risk is absolutely key. Another phrase that many financial services providers can be very familiar with is ongoing monitoring. And again, this is a term that can be quite difficult to apply in practice, and there can be some misunderstanding about what its intention is. Essentially, it means that financial services providers must have systems in place to monitor the risks identified and assessed, as they may change or evolve over time. So it's important that financial services providers have appropriate systems to monitor certain aspects of their client transactions. This includes changes in a customer's profile or transaction activity or behaviour, which come to light in the normal course of business, but also the vulnerability of certain products and services being used for money laundering or terrorist financing purposes, and how these may change, supported by typologies, law enforcement feedback. And finally, the adequacy of your staff training and awareness is key. They must be aware of emerging risks, of regular risks, of red flags, and they must be able to act quickly. So things for financial service providers to consider when they are looking at their ongoing monitoring or devising a policy for ongoing monitoring is that they need to consider the adequacy of their internal coordination mechanisms, that is, between the AML, CFT compliance and other functions and areas. The effectiveness of compliance arrangements. So do you have internal audit or external review? Do you have 3 lines of defence within your organisation? The performance of third parties who are relied on for CDD purposes, and indeed any outsourcing. Do you have robust controls and QAing around those processes? Changes in relevant laws or regulatory requirements, are you adapting quickly and in a timely fashion to those changes, such as changes in sanctions rules? And changes in the risk profile of countries to which the financial services providers or its customers are exposed. So again, sanctions would come into play there, but equally just any open source of information that may be relevant to you managing and mitigating your risks. And you should not forget, of course, about emerging risks. The nature of risks is that they do change all the time, and financial services providers should have ongoing monitoring systems and controls to identify and assess those emerging risks, such as those currently relating to the COVID-19 pandemic. So where a new risk has emerged or an emerging risk has increased, your risk assessments should be subjected to regular reviews to ensure they adequately reflect these new risks. You should also assess information obtained as part of your ongoing monitoring business relationships and consider whether these would affect your current risk assessments and whether they should be updated. There are also emerging risks very specifically to do with new technologies, and all financial services providers should have systems in place to be able to identify and assess those risks. So, for example, new business practices, new delivery mechanisms, the use of new technology for new or pre-existing products. And we've got some examples here, such as digital storage and documentation storage, verification of documentation, screening systems, use of virtual or digital currencies. So if financial services providers are using any of these new technologies or new products and assessing these new risks, they should undertake a risk assessment prior to the launch of such products and make sure that any identified risks are in your business risk assessment. Equally, they should make sure that staff are aware of these new developments and identified methodologies, and ensure that all your systems and procedures are kept up to date to identify any potential new risks and the impact this may have on the products and services that are offered by your financial institutions. So last but certainly not least, documentation. It's absolutely key that financial services providers document their risk-based approach policies and procedures. That includes their ongoing monitoring, reviews and responses, and it should be able to demonstrate to any supervisory authority, including the monetary authority, how you've assessed those money laundering risks, details about how you've implemented appropriate systems and procedures, and how you monitor and improve the effectiveness of your systems and procedures. And it's the expectation of the monetary authority that such AML reviews and assessments would be approved by the board of the financial services provider. So let's briefly recap what makes a really effective risk-based approach and how you can manage and mitigate according to that risk-based approach. So the start position was looking at your risk assessment, which is your inherent risk, customers, products, transactions and services, geography and delivery channels, but also inherent risk from publicly available information such as national risk assessments and the sectoral risk assessments published by CIMA. Then you have your compliance programme. You are essentially the gatekeepers to these risks, and there are certain tools you can use to manage those risks, such as your client due diligence, when and where and how you use enhanced due diligence, your transaction monitoring, your policies and procedures, good training and awareness around risks, but also around reporting suspicions to the relevant authorities. Finally, oversight. Senior management oversight of AML risk is absolutely key to ensuring that there is effective management and mitigation of risk and awareness top down through your financial services institution. So the board of directors, there should be AML audits, internal control audits, compliance functions should all be working together to manage and mitigate those risks. So we've briefly set out here the overview of the changes that have come into the AMLRs, which prompted us to issue new guidance notes on the risk-based approach. We'd also like to point you in the direction of some additional resources which may help you with your understanding of this area of risk management, the risk-based approach. So we've alluded to the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, the interpretive notes at recommendation 10. We've also got the anti-money laundering regulations in this jurisdiction, and regulations 5 and 12 are the most relevant provisions. This presentation was driven by us publishing our guidance notes of February 2020 on assessing risks and applying a risk-based approach, but we also have published one specifically on ongoing monitoring, as we're aware this can be a tricky area. Finally, we've published our combined 2019 sectoral risk ratings, which on a more nuanced basis go through each sector, and these should be read and understood by financial services providers in order that they can adapt and apply these risks identified into their own risk management and ongoing monitoring systems and controls and procedures. Finally, there's a number of AML CFT newsletters that CIMA publishes on a regular basis, such as our recent advisory on emerging risks connected to COVID-19, but also our recent issue of the Anchor, which covers some guidance around targeted financial sanctions. So thank you very much for listening today. I hope that you found it interesting and have taken something away from this presentation as to how you can go ahead and apply an effective risk-based approach. Should you have any questions arising from this presentation or from the guidance notes that are published on our website, please do not hesitate to get in touch. Our contact details are here on the last slide. Contact AML CFT at cima.ky.